The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. Also, without objection, the meeting record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ms. Sewell, members of the committee, and witnesses for being here today. Unfortunately, Ranking Member Morelli is unable to join us today due to a loss in his family. I want to offer my sincere condolences, and our thoughts are with him and his family during this time. Today we have Congresswoman Claudia Tenney and Congressman John Sarbanes who will be joining us shortly. They've both been waived on the committee to participate in today's hearing. I'd like to welcome both of you. I'll welcome both of them to the committee when they arrive shortly. The remarks have not been updated for the timing of their attendance. The Constitution reserves power over federal elections to the states, requiring them to set election law and to administer federal elections with Congress in the oversight role. Election administration looks different in every state, and that's our federalist approach in action. It's critical that all voters understand and trust the election process and our outcomes. And the empirical data is clear that when voters are more confident, they're more likely to participate. That's why we must continue to support states in their efforts to build voter confidence and equip them with the tools that they need. Our hearing today is the first in a series leading up to the introduction of the American Confidence in Elections Act, or the ACE Act. Unlike the previous majorities for the PEOPLE Act, our ACE Act has been drafted in the open over the course of nearly 3 years. And I plan to continue to move the ACE Act through regular order. I was proud to work with former Ranking Member Rodney Davis to introduce the ACE Act last Congress. We worked with state and local election administrators and stakeholders across the country to write this legislation. This important bill is part of the House Republican Conference's commitment to America as we work to deliver a government that is more accountable. Following lessons learned in the 2022 midterm election, we're making tweaks to further strengthen the bill. Ultimately, this comprehensive legislation will provide states with the tools to build voter confidence and enhance election integrity. The bill has 3 main pillars, and these include 1, providing states with voluntary tools and resources for running elections with the highest integrity that voters can have confidence in. 2, implementing much-needed reforms in D.C. to clean up years of elections difficulty here and to clearly demonstrate the positive effects of strong election integrity policies. And 3, protecting free speech. Today's hearing will focus on the first and largest section of the bill. This section provides states with voluntary tools they can implement to bolster voter confidence while removing outdated federal policies that often get in the way. For example, while the U.S. Constitution prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections, states need better tools to enforce these prohibitions. And the bill would ensure state and county election officials have access to information held only by federal agencies like the Social Security death list and citizenship status to keep their voter rolls maintained. Additionally, the bill helps the Election Assistance Commission better focus their work. This will enhance a federal forum to encourage information sharing among states as they solve election administration challenges. The ACE Act will modernize EAC's testing and certification program for elections equipment and ensure not only that states, counties, and municipalities have the guidance they need to use federal election grant funds, but also that taxpayer dollars are being protected. It also addresses another key issue that arose during the 2020 election when private funding of election administration was abused to target voters expected to vote for certain candidates. Some states have since prohibited localities from accepting these dollars. It's also appropriate for Congress to review the federal tax benefits of some of these groups, something Rep. Tenney and I have been leading along the way. Additionally, Congress must also hold accountable the executive branch. Every federal agency has an important role in serving the American people. Yet as part of the Biden administration's Promoting Access to Voting executive order, federal agencies were directed to go beyond the scope of their missions and essentially act as voter registration sites. Voter registration is absolutely critical, and we encourage every voter to participate. However, that's not necessarily the responsibility of federal agencies, but rather of secretaries of state and other state and county officials. Directing federal agencies to engage in political activities should concern everyone. These are just some of the issues we address in the ACE Act. This bill is our Federalist approach to equip states with key election integrity tools. We're committed to respecting our constitutional system and the differences of each state. This bill isn't a one-size-fits-all federal mandate, but rather a set of tools to help everyone improve our current system. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. With our collective decades of experience, I look forward to your testimony as we examine the ACE Act. Thank you, and I now yield to Ms. Sewell for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chair acknowledged, Ranking Member Morelli is unable to be here today due to a death in his family. I know we all offer him our sincerest condolences. Today, we are discussing state tools to promote voter confidence. To do so, we must acknowledge a truth. Perpetuating falsehoods about stolen or insecure elections undermines our confidence. Acknowledging and alleging a lack of voter confidence or a lack of integrity in the electoral system is a false justification to rationalize the enactment of suppressive voter laws and procedures such as eliminating ballot drop box, restricting mail-in voting, enacting suppressive voter ID laws, and discriminatory voter list maintenance practices that result in otherwise eligible voters being removed from the rolls. Instead, confidence in election means every eligible voter feels confident that they can access and cast a ballot, that ballot will be counted, and that it was counted as a cast. When voters see voting methods their communities have been using for decades suddenly being attacked without evidence, it does not promote voter confidence. Indeed, ensuring eligible voters have access to the franchise promotes voter confidence. One of the most critical tools states have to promote voter confidence are well-trained, well-resourced election officials. People who administer elections year after year are known in their communities and who voters can turn to for accurate information. However, these trusted public servants have become the targets of harassment and threats. A survey of local election officials published earlier this year by the Brennan Center for Justice found that nearly 3 in 4 feel that threats against election officials have increased in recent years, and 30% say that they have personally been abused, harassed, or threatened because of their job. The survey also found that given the rate at which officials are leaving the profession, we can expect more than a 1 in 5 local election officials to be serving in their first presidential election in 2024. We need to ensure that these officials have the training and resources needed to carry out the critical work of administering our elections. Our democracy does not function without them. As we discussed at a committee hearing last month, election officials have worked hard and made significant strides to increase transparency in the electoral process and provide opportunities for the public to better understand what can otherwise be a cumbersome and hard process. The Supreme Court has found that voting is a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights, and Congress has broad powers to legislate under the Election Clause. We should be making it easier to vote. As election officials, we should be making sure that access to the ballot box is easy. We also must be truthful. There is no evidence of widespread voter fraud in the United States elections. It is already hard to cheat. And committing acts of fraud, voter fraud, is already against the law. Continuing to perpetuate false claims of rigged elections undermines voter confidence. Passing laws that restrict voters' access to the ballot box undermines voter confidence. Casting election officials as a part of a conspiracy to steal an election undermines voter confidence. Since the founding of our our country, large segments of the American people have been intentionally excluded from the right to vote, and their access to the ballot box has been purposefully curtailed. Claiming that higher voter turnout numbers mean restrictive voter laws do not have suppressive or discriminatory effect, while ignoring evidence of significant racial turnout gaps, that undermines voter confidence. While many minority communities overwhelmed by barriers to casting their vote, it does not make those barriers fair. It certainly does not justify or validate their existence. This committee's role in conducting oversight of federal elections is critical. We must work to protect access to the ballot box, ensure states and localities have the funding and resources they need to conduct free and fair elections, protect election workers from harassment and threats. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, Mr. Chair, and the discussion to follow. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sewell. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made part of the record hearing, of the hearing record if they're submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm that the testimony that you're about to give today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative and may be seated. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness, West Virginia Secretary of State, Mac Warner, is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point and spent 23 years in the United States Army, deployed to military hotspots around the world while serving on the staff of the United States Army War College. Since taking his oath of office in 2017, Secretary Warner has been recognized throughout the country for his innovation in cybersecurity and election preparation. Under Secretary Warner's leadership, West Virginia became the first state in the nation to offer voting by mobile device for overseas citizens and military personnel deployed to remote areas of the world during election time. Our next witness, Mr. Ken Cuccinelli, currently serves as the national chairman for the Election Transparency Initiative. Previously, Mr. Cuccinelli served in the federal government, first as the acting director of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then as the acting deputy secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. In addition to practicing law for over 25 years, Mr. Cuccinelli served in the Virginia Senate from 2002 to 2010, and as Virginia's Attorney General from 2010 to 2014. Our next witness, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, is a senior fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Messi III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. As the manager of the think tank's Election Law Reform Initiative, Mr. Van Spakovsky studied campaign finance restrictions, voter fraud, voter ID, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, administration of elections, and voting equipment standards. In 2017, President Donald Trump appointed him to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Our next witness, Commissioner Don Palmer, was appointed by President Donald Trump and confirmed in the United States Senate in 2019 to serve as the United States Election Assistance Commission Commissioner. During his tenure at the Election Assistance Commission, Commissioner Palmer has served as the designated federal officer for the EAC's Technical Guidelines Development Committee, which is charged with developing the voluntary voting system guidelines, which sets standards for voting machine testing and certification. Commissioner Palmer is a former secretary of the Virginia Board of Elections and served as the Commonwealth's chief election official from 2011 to 2014. He also previously served as Florida's state election director. And finally, Mr. Joseph Gloria began his career in the elections in 1992 as a voting machine technician in Doña Ana County, New Mexico. It was Doña. I saw you nod your head. I was confirming there. In June of 2013, Mr. Gloria named the Registrar of Voters for Clark County, Nevada, becoming the top election administrator for the Las Vegas metropolitan area. Mr. Gloria currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Operations for the Election Center. We appreciate all of our witnesses being here today and look forward to your testimony. As a reminder, we've read your written statements and will appear in full in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 9, you're limited to your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement unless I extend the time period in consultation with Ms. Sewell. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask you to please wrap up. I'll now recognize Secretary Mac Warner for 5 minutes.
West Virginians pride ourselves as frontiersmen who blaze trails rather than follow paths. Ever since 1775, when Captain Hugh Stevenson led his mountaineer militia on the beeline march to Boston to reinforce George Washington, thus creating the U.S. Army, West Virginians have fought for independence and security. Interestingly, a controversy at the time generated citizen petitions seeking fair elections in Appalachia. West Virginia has suffered election fraud, including John Kennedy's buying votes and stealing the 1960 Democrat primary from Hubert Humphrey. Since my election in 2016, we've been fighting for election integrity. The U.S. Constitution states that the time, place, and manner of elections shall be left to state legislatures. Working with our legislature, we've built perhaps the best balanced election access with election security process in the country. Here are 3 elements of successful elections. First, state autonomy. West Virginia does not rely on federal funding for election security. We have permanent state funding for equipment, security, and maintenance. Autonomous tools that we have include GIS technology to improve elections and the voter experience. A See Something, Text Something program to deter fraud and enhance investigations. Dispersed investigators to reach trouble spots quickly. Fusion office, National Guard and DNR election assistance, and a clearinghouse to triage election complaints. States have different histories and voting practices. There is not and should not be a one-size-fits-all policy for election procedures. State autonomy with legislatures making the rules is key. Second, voter confidence that begins with clean voter rolls followed by easy ballot access and corresponding security. Working with county clerks, we have removed over 400,000 names from West Virginia voter rolls, approximately 1 of every 4 registrants. Nothing good comes from bloated, out-of-date voting rolls. Citizens know their votes will not be diluted by ineligible voters or ballots cast outside the law. Voter ID, using modern equipment, and producing results on election night are all things that build public confidence. MIT has independently put West Virginia near the top of states in voter confidence. Third, federal government needs to get out of the way and let states run their elections. Here are examples. The NVRA blackout period for changing voter rolls should be left to the states. Waiting 4 federal election cycles to remove bad registrations is unnecessary. The federal postcard application should require voter ID. UOCAVA voters should be required to show proof of citizenship. The post office should freely share NCOA and vacant address databases. CISA should provide the SAFE database free of charge to states, and the Social Security Administration should do likewise for deaths. A proper role for the federal government is the American Confidence in Elections Act. It empowers states without federal overreach. So how do we restore faith in America's elections? The devious misuse of federal agencies to throw the 2020 election was despicable. 51 so-called intelligence experts purposefully misled the American people just 2 weeks prior to the election by leading people to believe that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian effort. Instead, it was a disinformation campaign, that is, a purposeful lie done with the intent to throw the presidential election. The letter was intentionally wrong, and the FBI allowed the disinformation operation to occur under its watch. The situation was made worse when candidate Joe Biden cited the letter to discredit President Trump. Biden's campaign knew the letter to be a lie of their own making. In what may be the most insidious election interference in U.S. history, the Biden campaign colluded with members and former members of the CIA, DNI, NSA, and FBI to mount a disinformation campaign against the American people for political purposes. Every agency and person who took part in this election interference should be excoriated, the participants fired, their security clearances revoked, and criminal charges initiated where appropriate. That is the way to restore voter confidence in America. What our own federal agencies did in the 2020 election was not legitimate or fair. Their conduct was worse than anything Russia or China did to interfere with our elections. We expect disinformation campaigns from those nations, but we do not and should not have to anticipate purposeful attacks and disinformation from our own government. Other actions to enhance confidence include, first, revisit the NVRA. There is no need for DMVs to register people to vote. Second, reduced mail-in voting. President Carter warned absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. When ballots arrive before and after Election Day, the voting occurs away from the watchful eye of trained officials from opposing parties, and voters lose confidence. Third, prioritize enforcement of election laws. DOJ has stopped investigating most election violations and placed undue emphasis on so-called threats to election officials. This is a veiled attempt to silence people speaking out against irregularities. Fourth, stop using courts to change election processes. Lawfare has judges rather than legislators making election laws. Pre-election court actions must be curtailed, and post-election courts must prioritize election challenges before elections are certified. Thank you for giving me this chance to testify.
Thank you very much, Secretary Warner. Mr. Cuccinelli, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me today to discuss what's working and what does not work well in our state voting systems. As you noted, I previously served as the Attorney General of Virginia. Prior to that, I was in Virginia State Senate for 3 terms. One of those elections was a recount, and as the people of this committee know, that means litigation. That's true in all 50 states, so I've been through those situations as well, and also served in the Department of Homeland Security as the Acting Deputy Secretary. And I would like to make a point that is rarely discussed from that perspective, because the federal government does not have really any role in the execution of elections. However, we do have a role in protecting against foreign interference in elections, and I was involved in that role in 2020. And I would point out a much overlooked fact. We all hear all the time about financial diversification. Don't buy one stock, buy 20 stocks. Well, security can work similarly. America's elections are more secure for having 51 systems than if we had one Washington takeover and one system. The danger to an opponent of attempting to interfere, and I don't mean media interference, I don't mean Facebook ads, I mean actually touching machinery, is much, much higher when they don't really know which states are going to determine the outcome, and they all have different systems. It is easier for us to catch them when they attempt to try to break into a variety of systems than if we had only one system. And we've all seen how effective we are at protecting our own systems. We saw this in 2020. We learned that the Russians had been in our government systems for 1.5 years or more, the civilian side. That is a tremendous source of protection of U.S. elections against foreign interference. And again, I'm not talking misinformation here. The interference I'm talking about is actually touching the systems, the computer systems, adjusting outcomes, voter rolls, and so forth. Doesn't mean that's impossible now, but if they can get into one system, they can get into one system. But of 51, that risks America's democracy less than if they could get into one system and there was only one system. It is a very important reason why Washington should never try to centralize elections with one federalized system. I think that's a unique perspective that I don't hear, frankly, mentioned enough, and that is still a relevant benefit of federalism. Perhaps not in a way you're used to thinking of, nonetheless. With respect to UOCAVA and motor voter, I would simply, I'll shorten my time by emphatically agreeing with the specific comments of Secretary Warner. The blackout periods, for instance, the federal government literally getting in the way of states cleaning up their own systems. And this is used often in the lawfare, you heard the Secretary reference, as a way to block cleanup. Los Angeles County recently had to remove 1.2 million bad entries on their voter rolls, and those had been stopped for years and years. Those are places where fraud and confusion and the reduction of confidence can easily hide. The Carter-Baker Commission of 2005 spoke to some of these problems. I would urge this committee and the ACE Act to keep the voluntary approach you have from the federal government to states, but also to clean up UOCAVA, particularly with respect to ID and citizenship, and motor voter with respect to cleaning the rolls and getting out of states' way, frankly, of doing the best job they can. And last but not least, it's nice to hear comments about how we're all against perpetuating falsehoods. It would have been nice to hear that in 2000, 2001, 4, 16, 17, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems those sorts of allegations are leveled for pure partisan effect, not to actually clean up our elections.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cuccinelli. Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Sorry. Thank you for the invitation to be here. We have to have both access and security in our elections. In contrast to what some mistakenly claim, it is possible to provide both. One does not cancel out the other. Now, in addition to state laws that require election officials to maintain accurate voter rolls, federal law imposes the same requirement. The Help America Vote Act has detailed provisions that ensure voter registration records are supposed to be accurate. And similarly, the National Voter Registration Act, we're coming up on its 30-year anniversary, actually has a provision saying, quote, that states have to protect the integrity of the electoral process by ensuring the maintenance of an accurate and current voter registration roll. The problem is states are not, many of them, not doing a good job of doing this. They need to be conducting frequent comparisons between their statewide voter lists and their databases maintained by their departments of motor vehicle, their vital records, their corrections departments, their revenue department, and their public welfare and assistance departments to find address changes, deaths, citizenship status, and other factors affecting eligibility. They should also be frequently using the U.S. Postal Service's National Change of Address System, which, as Secretary Warner says, should be free. It's entirely a state responsibility, but federal cooperation is required. That includes providing free access to Social Security Administration records. That's something required by the Help America Vote Act. And since citizenship is required to vote in federal and state elections, with the exception of some local elections in a small number of states, they should be given unfettered access to DHS databases that contain information on aliens within the United States. In the same way that the National Voter Registration Act requires all U.S. attorneys to provide federal felony conviction information to state election officials, the NVRA should be amended to require all federal courts to provide relevant jury information to state election officials. If someone is excused from jury duty because they are not a U.S. citizen or they no longer live in the state, that information should be sent back to election officials, because it's from election officials that federal courts get their lists to begin with. The move by some local jurisdictions, such as the District of Columbia, to allow aliens to vote in local elections, disenfranchises citizens by diluting their votes, something we passed the Voting Rights Act to prevent. By allowing anyone who lives in the nation's capital for 30 days to vote in local elections, there's nothing to prevent aliens who are here illegally from voting, or diplomats from foreign embassies, many hostile to the United States, from voting in local elections, and allowing reporters from their propaganda outlets like Pravda and the People's Daily from voting. That is a recipe for foreign interference. The NVRA has been misinterpreted by the courts, and it should be clarified that it does not prevent states from requiring proof of citizenship to vote. That is no different from the fact that the federal government requires you to provide proof that you are a U.S. citizen or an alien legally in this country to get a job. And being able to be employed and support your family is just as important as the right to vote. Voter ID requirements For photo ID and absentee voting, it should be a requirement in every state. All of the turnout data and evidence shows this does not suppress anyone's vote, and it is a basic security measure no different than similar requirements, for example, entering government buildings like the Department of Justice. Finally, while both in-depth financial and accounting audits are a standard practice in the business world and nonprofit world, they are almost non-existent in public elections. But for the same reasons that they are ubiquitous in the business world at large, audits should be a customary requirement for our public elections after elections are over. This not only would help guarantee the honesty and effectiveness of the election process, but would help assure the public, candidates, political parties, and the media that they can be confident in the security and integrity of our elections. We want to ensure that every eligible citizen is able to vote and that those votes are not diluted, voted, or stolen due to errors, mistakes, fraud, or other problems in the election system. Common sense measures like voter ID, election audits, clean voter rolls, secure absentee ballot management, and transparency in the entire process will do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. von Spakovsky. Commissioner Palmer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Congresswoman Sewell, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the extensive work of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or EAC, as we help state officials prepare for the 2024 elections. The integrity of U.S. elections, coupled with cybersecurity measures, play a crucial role in our national security. This important hearing demonstrates your commitment to our nation's elections, and I appreciate your attention. The EAC was established by the Help America Vote Act, HAVA. Since that time, the agency has worked closely with election officials by distributing grant funds, certifying voting systems, highlighting best practices, collecting data through the EVE survey, and developing numerous clearinghouse products and services. Elections are administered by the states, and our efforts are vital to this endeavor. As such, we are extremely grateful for the agency funding and close attention to our work from Congress in recent years. Your steadfast support has proven instrumental to the Commission and to election administrators across the country. The EAC is making significant progress toward fulfilling its mission to improve the administration of elections. Over the past year, the agency continued to administer $955 million in HAVA security grants to the states, territories, and the District of Columbia. With the outstanding work of state and local election officials and assistance from the EAC and our trusted federal partners, the 2022 midterm elections were administered successfully. We aim to amplify support for the work of election officials, which should all give the American people public confidence that our elections are safe, secure, accessible, and secure. The American people should know that the nation's voting systems have integrity, and the votes will be counted as cast. Most recently, in keeping closely engaged with state and local administrators, the EAC has held annual meetings of our advisory boards. The Board of Advisors and the Standards Board are instrumental in keeping and helping the agency maintain various HAVA responsibilities. The Local Leadership Council, made up of local election leaders, serves as a source of unbiased analysis to the EAC on election administrative topics, including list maintenance, voting system user practices, ballot administration, and other matters. The Board of Advisors concluded their meeting just yesterday here in D.C. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for attending and presenting to us. Standards Board met last week in Phoenix, Arizona. At these collaborative meetings, the agency shared election security information and tools to increase voter confidence. Both forums provided us direct feedback from lawmakers, election officials, and other experts. As part of our ESTEP program, which is the Election Supporting Technology Evaluation Program, more states and localities will adopt technology to assist with election administration. Officials are looking for the EAC for voluntary standards and guidance. Congress and EAC continue to analyze the practicality of this program to offer potential solutions and efficiencies. Introduced in the 117th Congress, the American Confidence in Elections, ACE Act, included a provision related to voluntary standards for election supporting technology. The EAC would benefit from explicit statutory authorization to include several types of election supporting technology in our ongoing work related to cybersecurity. The agency's Testing and Certification Division is working to launch a field services program to help election officials strengthen their overall posture and preparedness regarding voting systems. 2022, the Commission also made considerable progress by implementing version 2.0 of the VVSG. These new guidelines incorporate technology, advancements in cybersecurity, accuracy, accessibility, usability, and auditability of the new voting machines. With the adoption of 2.0, the EAC is now building a bridge from our current strong standards for the 2024 election to the next generation of voting systems. The EAC Clearinghouse Division, made up of former election officials and subject matter experts, helped the EAC share these practices, information for voters, and other resources to election officials. To this end, the EAC is continuing work on an online clearinghouse network, a collaborative peer-to-peer platform where election officials can find resources, connect with experts and colleagues in other jurisdictions across the country, and discuss emerging issues. A core component of the EAC mission is distributing, monitoring, and auditing the use of federal grants, the improvement of federal elections and security. Federal HAVA funds, including the recent appropriation, are a key resource for election administrators dealing with ever-growing demands. As this committee considers election administration reform legislation, the EAC stands ready to serve as a helpful resource. I appreciate your work on the ACE Act, and thank you for recognizing the EAC's leadership role and the vital assistance you provide to election officials. Thank you for your support to the EAC and the tireless commitment to state and local officials. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Palmer. Mr. Gloria, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile. Ranking Member Morelli, Subcommittee Ranking Member Sewell, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the critical issue of voter confidence. Confidence in elections is critical to the success of our democracy in the United States of America. Election officials need support from local, state, and federal government to ensure they have the funding, training, tools, and equipment they need to be successful in an ever-increasingly challenging environment. Today, election officials all throughout the country are being asked to develop their expertise across an ever-growing list of areas while being under the brightest of microscopes, administering elections with zero faults, and all while being responsible for the safety of their staff, families, and themselves. Prior to my retirement in January of this year, I supervised elections in Clark County, Nevada as the appointed registrar of voters. During my over 30-year career as an election official, the most challenging portion of my career came during the 2020 and 2022 election cycles. In 2020, election officials across the nation rose to the numerous challenges that accompanied administering an election during the COVID pandemic. This forced us to quickly adjust our services to voters in order to give everyone equal access to the process of voting without putting voters in a position to expose themselves to the virus. Prior to the 2020 general election, the largest number of mail-ballots counted in Clark County, Nevada during an election was just over 45,000. This number increased tenfold to over 450,000 in the 2020 general election. Although the pandemic had subsided in 2022, challenges stemming from the widespread distribution of false information about the election officials and election administration continued. A silver lining from the 2020 election cycle is that we were able to learn from what we experienced by increasing transparency, providing outreach to voters in an effort to educate them on our well-developed processes, many of which were statutorily mandated processes, and purchasing equipment to increase the efficiency of our mail ballot processing. We welcome those questions about or concerns about our elections to be part of the process. And in addition to the challenges above caused by the widespread distribution of false information about elections, my staff, poll workers, and I received threats of physical harm. Messages were received including threats to our safety and vulgar insults claiming we had stolen the election. We even faced armed protesters outside of our voting facility, some of whom brandished weapons a short distance from our front door and verbally accosted staff members as they entered and exited our facility. Another challenge we were forced to deal with more than in any previous election was the recruitment of poll workers during the pandemic. In my new position as the Chief Election Officer for Operations with the Election Center, the National Association of Election Officials, I work for an organization with over a 35-year history of supporting election official education, certification, and networking opportunities. As a member of the Election Center since 2004, I attribute much of my success as an election administrator to the training and networking opportunities this organization provided me over the years. As a leader in the elections community, we work to collaborate with several organizations such as the EAC, CISA, National Association of Secretaries of State, National Association of State Election Directors, as well as other groups in the elections community, to provide information and opportunities to election officials to further their professionalism in election administration. We have begun work to expand opportunities for officials by adding classes at our conferences about how local and state election officials can develop in-state training programs and how to create and sustain their own state associations of and for local election administrators. This is incredibly important work. What is missing in some cases are the resources and knowledge on how to build and maintain these state organizations. In the past 2 years, we have seen an exodus from the profession. In some states, a third or even half of their election officials have left the work that they love and have dedicated their professional lives to. Election officials are exhausted, and many do not feel supported in the difficult work that they do. This loss of institutional knowledge intensifies the importance of strong training and educational programming. The Election Center stands ready to do its part as a leader in the community for providing training and networking opportunities for all election official members. Election administrators' education and training to improve the efficiency of their office, to serve the voters in the most effective way, but access is not uniformly available due to the limitations I have outlined. That is why it is so important that local, state, and federal agencies work to provide funding and support election officials across the nation. Long-term and consistent funding needs to be a priority to allow those who wish to obtain training in their fields to do so, as well as the ability to purchase the tools necessary to efficiently conduct elections in all jurisdictions, which will result in increased confidence in our voting processes by all voters. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gloria. I'll now recognize Mr. Loudermilk for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning our witnesses.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today for this very important topic. First, Mr. excuse me, this is a tongue twister for me. Spakovsky, how was that?
That was very good.
All right. Given your experience with working with the Department of Justice and in Fulton County, Georgia, what insights can you give us regarding photo or voter ID or real ID?
The claims that that suppresses votes have been proven to be untrue. I mean, Georgia's law has been in place, as you know, since the 2008 presidential election. Right. They've had record registration, record turnout since then. 2 years ago, the National Bureau of Economic Research actually released a study. They looked at 10 years' worth of data from 2008 through 2018, comparing states with voter ID to states that have no ID of any kind, like California and New York. And their conclusion was that voter ID has absolutely no effect on individuals, including, it doesn't matter what race they are, it doesn't matter their gender, it doesn't matter what socioeconomic group. We know that the public supports this because the polling on this is actually quite something. You know, Americans disagree on many issues very sharply. The one thing they agree on is that it's common sense to require an ID to vote. An overwhelming majority of Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, blacks, whites, Hispanics all think people should show an ID to vote. And the latest election in Georgia proves that once again. Georgia was harshly criticized for extending its voter ID requirement for in-person voting to absentee balloting. Well, I just released a study looking at the turnout of the voting eligible population. That's the one of the most accurate ways of looking at turnout. Georgia had turnout 6 percentage points above the national turnout, and it had better turnout than Delaware, the home state of the president, who harshly criticized the bill. It had higher turnout than California, the home of Nancy Pelosi, Representative Nancy Pelosi, who harshly criticized the bill, and it had higher turnout than the state of New York, the home state of Chuck Schumer, who harshly criticized the bill. So the idea that voter ID somehow keeps people from voting is just not true.
We had, in the last Congress, we had former Attorney General in here and was talking about this issue, and the polls had just come out that showed that 80% of Americans supported voter ID. And I asked him, do you support that? Or do you support the idea that 80% of Americans think there should be security in the elections and that you have to prove who you are and that you are eligible to vote? And he said, yes, depending on what type of ID. What he was getting at is, you know, we should use student IDs or some form of utility payment. How is that a problem? I mean, isn't it important that you have some form of verified identification?
It is. I can produce a utility bill using Word on my computer. You need a photo ID. And the key thing to keep in mind with this is that every single state that has put in an ID requirement, and that's now a majority of the states, has put in a requirement that if you don't have an ID, you can get one for free. And it just has proven not to be a problem. And like I said, we've got more than a decade's worth of data to show that it is not a problem.
Well, and I was part of the Georgia General Assembly in the House when we passed the voter ID bill, and it was highly supported. Let me shift quickly in the 1 minute I have and talk about voter rolls and the significant problems we have of voter rolls in our nation. Some states are compliant with Section 8 of the National Voter Registration Act and conduct routine list maintenance, how others refuse to do that. In your opinion, why would a state intentionally refuse to perform list maintenance?
I can't answer that. I mean, there's currently a lawsuit going on in Michigan against the Michigan Secretary of State because she refuses to take 27,000 individuals who are dead off the voter rolls. That was filed by the Public Interest Legal Foundation. And they verified the information themselves, sent it to the Secretary of State, and she refuses to take them off. You'd have to ask her why she's not willing to do that.
Well, see, Mr. Cuccinelli was responded. Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, look, I've been an attorney general. I've done investigations. I think the reason for it is the desire to keep to build in problems, to have muddy voter rolls that can be exploited. That's the only rational explanation, and that's unfortunate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Torres is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Cuccinelli, it is my understanding that you testified before a federal grand jury on efforts to undermine the 2020 presidential election. You also provided testimony to the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. And I have a few questions for you, sir. In a December 7th, 2021 transcribed interview, you discussed several instances where some officials related to former President Trump and his campaign approached you asking about the ability of the Department of Homeland Security, where you serve as acting deputy secretary, to seize voting machines. Your response during those conversations was that DHS did not have the authority to take such a step. Isn't that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. The final report of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol discusses a phone call on December 31st, 2020, where former President Trump asked you whether DHS could seize voting machines. As discussed in the final report, your response to former President Trump was again that DHS did not have the authority to seize voting machines, correct?
That does not sound correct, no.
Okay, I have here the report on page 397 that states, at that point, the president called Ken Cuccinelli. Donahue recalled the president saying something along the lines of, Ken, the acting attorney general is telling me it is your job to seize machines. Do you recall that?
No. And what I specifically don't recall is ever having that conversation by phone. I had one conversation, I think that might just be a misunderstanding there. I was in present and to the earlier question, one person asked me, that was Rudy Giuliani. I think that's well established at this point. I gave him my answer, no, we don't have that authority. I was never pressed on it again. The president asked that question of me one time. I answered the same way, and I was not pressed on it again.
So my follow-up question to you, you were consistent, correct, in your
Yes.
response that the federal government did not have the authority to seize the voting machines.
No, that the Department of Homeland Security did not have the authority to seize voting machines, given the set of facts as I understood them.
Okay, my correction, that the Department of Homeland Security, as you were being asked by President Trump, did not have the authority to seize those machines.
That's correct.
Now, how do you think this looks to the American people when the former president and his advisors repeatedly express an interest in seizing voting machines, especially after being repeatedly advised by senior officials in the Department of Justice and at DHS that the government lacked such authority?
So again, you're expanding to the whole government. The FBI has very substantial jurisdictional authority. The Department of Homeland Security does not.
Okay, so how do you feel about how that looks to the general public? What's your opinion?
So I expect to be asked questions. I answered those questions, and I appreciated the fact that that was the end of the discussion as it related to me. There was no pressure to do any of that. So
I didn't ask you that. I asked you, what is your opinion on how that looked to the general public, that you were being asked to do something that you knew that the department that you worked for at least did not have the authority to do that?
So I had to research the question. I didn't just know it. I don't take offense at being asked a question.
That was not my question.
Well, it was. How do you feel about being asked about this? That was the only exchange that I had on the subject.
How do you think that this looks to the general public? Do you think that it promotes confidence in our elections when the president is being asked of its officials to do something that they do not have the authority to do?
Well, he asked the officials, do you have the authority? The answer is no, and I was never ordered or asked to do that. So he respected that answer. And I think that, so you asked about feelings. I feel that the average American would appreciate the president respecting that answer.
So when you say the president respected that answer, but yet time and time again, we heard over television the president saying, or over the radio, the president saying, we're demanding that these machines be seized.
So the usual legal authority for that would be within the states if there is a problem. And again, you may cite his other comments, but
My time is up. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman, Mr. Murphy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming today. I'll just actually continue on that line of questioning. Mr. Cuccinelli, how do you think the American people would feel that the Michigan State Secretary of State would allow 27,000 dead people to be on a roll?
I think they'd be astonished.
I know.
And in the follow-up, that they couldn't conceive of a legitimate, clean, legal reason to do that.
I'm kind of flabbergasted. I mean, I don't know how she says that personally with a straight face.
Well, Mr. Murphy, she is not alone. I mean, Los Angeles had to be ordered to take 1.2 million non-voters off the rolls. 1.2 million, and this goes on all around the country,
So
unfortunately.
I'll just push that further. What intent other than fraud could there be for wanting to allow such things?
I don't think there is any other intent.
help me out here. Is there something
I think
else?
it is to leave open the opportunity. Short of fraud, there is also mere confusion, and I believe the left has, and knows it has, and tries to exploit, having a litigation advantage, because they're just staffed up around the country and have been for 20 years, to sue. Prior to you coming in, I noted one of my races was a recount, and that's litigation. And the left has a bigger litigation machine by far than the right, and so muddiness and confusion works to their advantage. It leads into litigation where they deem themselves to have an advantage.
I'm just, you know, I'd love to think that people just want to be fair on both sides and let the issues make what they are. And somewhat in that same line, Mr. Spakovsky, Griffith, you did better. Could you opine as to why anybody would be against voter ID? What is the rationale to say it's wrong?
Well, I think some folks have been under the mistaken impression that it keeps people from voting. As the turnout data has now proven, that's just simply not true. Not only that, but the polling shows that people support that idea. So once you know that it doesn't actually keep people from voting, I don't know why you would be against it. If you are, then you must be against requiring a photo ID for the many other
to get on a phone, to get your SNAP benefits, to get your Medicaid benefits, to you know, do anything. Again, I'm just trying to figure out what rationale other than wantingly to commit fraud would there be for these things?
I don't know. I'm not going to speak for folks who are against it, but I just do know that the evidence on this shows it does not keep people from voting. And in fact, I think there's some evidence that it actually enhances confidence and may help increase turnout. In Georgia, when the voter ID law was in place for the first time in 2008, presidential election, they had a huge increase in turnout, and turnout there in that state, they maintained it by race. Huge increase in turnout of African-American voters and Hispanic voters.
It was a 5% total increase when it was the, quote, the most restrictive, you know, law put forth. Anyway, that's just nonsense. Let me just follow up on another question. One means to increase election integrity and boost confidence are post-election audits. When we discuss them, we refer to actions such as making sure the electrical equipment is working, ballots were cast were eligible, and qualified voters. We're not talking about ballot recounts where there's not comprehensive audits. We're just talking about integrity of these things. So looking back across the United States, how common do we have post-election audits at both the state and local level? I mean, is this a common thing? Is it not a common thing?
In terms of comprehensive audits, not a recount, that's not an audit. Comprehensive audits, almost no one does it. The first state that has put in a requirement—
Should we be doing it?
Yes, we should. Texas has passed a law requiring audits. Their Secretary of State's office has formed a brand-new audit division, and right now they're just— because no one's done it, there aren't any standards for it. I did publish a paper last year in which I took the kind of standards that are used in financial audits and converted those to the kind of standards we ought to have for election audits. And this should not be a partisan thing.
Absolutely not.
Everyone should agree that we should have post-election audits that look at the entire process, because—
All right, let me just get, well, I'm sorry, let me just get one more question in for you. President Biden issued an executive order March 2021 to supposedly to promote, quote, access to voting. In the order, he directed federal employees to get involved in state elections by meddling in voter registration efforts and mail-in ballot and other activities. Is this a constitutional authority?
I didn't think he had any authority to do that, and as Secretary Warner said in a letter along with a number of other secretaries of state, this basically interfered and could cause chaos and confusion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. I want to start by just clearing up a misconception. I'm a staunch supporter of making sure that we have access to voting. And I believe that when a state picks winners and losers based on that photo ID, that it's not fair. No one, let me repeat, no one in the movement for voting rights ever said that we are against photo ID. Let's be very clear. What I'm against is if my state chooses to have the photo ID, accept the photo ID of a hunting license but not a student ID. Is that fair? I would say no. I would say that you're making it harder for students to vote, and that's not— every American should have access to the ballot box. So I want to just clear up this misconception that somehow we don't want photo IDs. or any IDs. And I think that what we are really challenging is the reality that some people don't have driver's license. Some people don't travel abroad, so they don't have a passport. Some people don't hunt. Some people don't fish. When states pick winners and losers based on their policies and laws, I think there's a role for the federal government to play in oversight. When a state like North Dakota decides that the only way you can register to vote in that state is that you have to have a physical address, and thousands of folks who live on Indian country have P.O. boxes, you're picking winners and losers. I think that that's unfair. I'm very proud of the fact that I carry the seminal piece of legislation to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I not only represent Alabama's 7th Congressional District, has in it Birmingham, Montgomery, and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. I grew up in that town. And so I'm very proud of the fact that I get to carry that bill. But let me tell you something. Never in a million years did I think that 58 years later, a daughter of Selma would have to have a bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. Never. We're going backwards and not forwards, and I have a serious problem with that. I think that when states go amok, there has to be oversight, and currently there isn't oversight. Why? The Supreme Court struck down Section 4, not the enforceability of it, by the way. The enforceability is federal oversight. That's Section 5. Section 4 is the formula to determine what states have gone amok, have just gone off the rails. And to assume that states don't have the ability to do that, picking winners and losers and the like, I'm not sure why someone would object to having a law that allows federal oversight when states are going too far. So I guess my question to you, and I'd like each of you to answer this question, is, do you believe that the federal government has any role, the oversight over states when it comes to voting rights? Mr. Warner, just simple yes or no.
Yes.
Do you believe in federal oversight?
Yes.
Preventing discrimination, yes, like Section 2.
Sir?
Yeah, that's what I did at the Justice Department, enforcing the Voting Rights Act, the NVRA, and UACAVA, but the authority is limited.
Just a simple yes or no, because I only have 41 minutes. Mr. Palmer? 41 seconds. I need to go back to my other hearing. Yes or no, sir?
Yes, and an assistance role.
And Mr. Gloria?
Yes, Congresswoman.
So I think the best thing that we in this committee, especially my subcommittee that I'm so happy to be ranking member of and really enjoy working with the chair, I think that we have to figure out a way to get some federal oversight back in. I think it's wrong when states pick winners and losers based on what type of ID. I believe in IDs. My dad, who was disabled, voted with a perfectly valid ID that every American has, a Social Security card, up until 2015 or 2014 when Alabama changed that law. Now, yes, you can say that you can get that ID for free, but the reality is you have to have access to transportation. You have to have access. The only reason why my dad got one is because I knew Secretary of State Merrill. That's unacceptable. You don't have to be a member of Congress to get access to photo ID. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Carey is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to go a little bit out of order here. Secretary Warner, it's good to see you. All the work you've done in Virginia, your family, Really proud Mountaineers, and it's good to have you before the committee. I do want to ask you a couple questions. First, is we have members of the military overseas fighting for our freedoms, and with that being said, there's no better place to focus our attention on the ability to give our military veterans and our service members the right to vote. What are the tools that you're using in West Virginia to increase military opportunities to vote?
The most prominent is the ability to vote using a mobile device. I had trouble, I was in Afghanistan for 5 years, and I had trouble voting. I went 6 months without being able to send or receive mail. My sons and daughters, all 4, have served in the military. Every one of them has had trouble voting. My brother's roommate, Shane Kimbrough, was commander of SpaceX. How's he supposed to vote on the space station if it's not using some sort of mobile device? That's why one of the first things I did when I went into office was I said, let's come up with an electronic way to transmit and receive ballots. So that's what we've done in the state of West Virginia. And who better than our military? But also, it worked so well in West Virginia that we went to voters with certain disabilities and now first responders. We actually deployed first responders to the state of Mississippi on a hurricane disaster relief within the 6-day period prior to an election, so they lost that ability to vote. That's why we've championed that. We now have a verifiable system to both check that the ballot that they send is the ballot received. So we're advancing that technology in those limited circumstances. I don't advocate going mainstream with this. I simply want it for those people who otherwise would be disenfranchised.
And I appreciate that. My next question is going to be to you, Mr. Palmer. The security and performance of election equipment used by our states and our localities has been under significant scrutiny. We've heard concerns from the public about the fact that there are components of our election equipment being manufactured outside of the United States. Is it true that there are certain components of the election equipment that are not made in America?
That is true.
So what would it take to reshore some of the election equipment used in the country's elections?
That would be a significant endeavor, since most of the voting equipment does use sources from outside the country. It would probably raise the price of election equipment significantly. There could be some requirements to assemble in the United States. There are other risk management strategies to sort on the supply chain, but there would be a significant cost to that for election equipment on the states.
What countries are these components being manufactured?
You have the Philippines, you have Taiwan, where you might have certain components, even Italy, European countries, and perhaps even China. But so there are states, there are nations out there that in the supply chain that provide materials that we simply don't manufacture today in mass quantities.
So it's safe to say that there could be companies that are Chinese, that whether they are manufacturing them or whether they have ownership of those companies that are actually Chinese companies.
Well, Chinese companies are providing components and materials to a piece of voting equipment, a voting system that is then manufactured by one of the vendors. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Chairman, yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Kilmer's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks all for being here. As you know, under federal law, there are disclaimer requirements, transparency requirements when campaigns run ads on TV, on radio, on satellite. However, on the large internet platforms, there aren't those sorts of requirements. They're not subject to those transparency laws. That's concerning, not just from a public's right to know standpoint, but we know that there are foreign adversaries that have tried to influence our elections through the purchase of online ads. There was a 2021 declassified assessment by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that pointed to Russia's online influence, Iran seeking to create and amplify social media content. There's been reports about China doing the same thing. Earlier this month, I joined with Mike Gallagher, my Republican colleague, on the Senate side, a bill, same bill, Amy Klobuchar and Lindsey Graham, a bill called the Honest Ads Act. And simply put, it has the same disclosure requirements that exist for TV, radio, and satellite and apply them to online political advertisement. And the goal here is both basic transparency, but also trying to prevent foreign actors from trying to influence our elections. Mr. Gloria, I was just hoping you could speak a bit about how the Election Center views these challenges around transparency of online political ads, and specifically the extent to which the status quo treatment of online political ads has impacted trust in our system.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I want to emphasize that the Election Center focuses on the administration of elections, and even as an election official, my main focus was in the administration. However, we always emphasize transparency. I can tell you that in my experience as an election official, we had a similar situation where several clerks and the registrars were having trouble educating the general public because we had certain groups that would send out voter registration material, and they did a poor job of qualifying their list. And so as a result, people who were already registered to vote were getting registration applications, and the general public assumed that it was coming from our office. So it created quite a bit of trouble. We passed legislation in Nevada that required those groups to identify their mailers as where they were coming from, and that created a better situation for us. It immediately improved. So I think that's a very similar situation to what you're describing. Transparency is very important, and knowing where information is coming from, I think, is vital to protecting against mis and disinformation that severely impacts election officials across the country.
I also was just hoping to ask you all about funding. I'm from Washington State. My state is second in voting accessibility. We had the third highest turnout in primary elections last year. I'd also note our state passed same-day voter registration, high school pre-registration, restoration of voting rights, automatic voter legislation, all on a bipartisan basis with a Republican Secretary of State. And they've been really helpful to helping our constituents participate in the process. I know federal funding and resources can help states with the execution of free and fair elections and improving voter access and cybersecurity, helping to train and unfortunately more and more protect poll workers. The Brennan Center released a poll that said the lack of federal funding actually hurts election security. 74% of local election officials say they need their annual budget to grow to address election security and administration in particular. I just hoped that each of you could just comment, and I only have a minute left, on how your states have used Help America Vote Act funding and the importance of those funds. A couple of us are on the Appropriations Committee, and I know the stability and consistency of that funding is a problem. So I don't know if you want to just speak briefly about the HAVA funds.
I can't speak to the specifics of Virginia, but your last comment, the stability, frequency and stability, a major concern would be, given how deeply bankrupt the federal government is, that if you start down too deeply down that path, you do end up with dependency. And when this, when the market stops buying your debt and you go off the cliff, and so many things the funding will get yanked, you're going to put the election system in a position where it's going to be a major victim of that coming federal government financial crash that there's no way around. I mean, trying to pretend it isn't going to happen is like avoiding math. So that's a real concern. It would be a lot like the funding change in our state budget in the internet bubble at the end of the 20th century. Northern Virginia, a lot of that money. And then when it went away, we had a lot of problems.
I know I'm over time. Thanks, Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Bice is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses, for being here with us this afternoon. I want to take a step back to May of 2020. I served in the Oklahoma State Senate. I actually oversaw the election board in my time there. And because of COVID, groups decided to sue the state of Oklahoma to remove the notary requirement for absentee ballots. Their argument was it was too onerous for an individual to try to find a notary to be able to verify the ballot, and that the particular statute that this was put in was in the wrong statute, and so a wrong title of law, so it did not qualify. The lawsuit was heard by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, in fact, that it was in the wrong title of law and threw out that requirement. The state of Oklahoma doesn't have any other way to verify ballots. And that happened 7 weeks before a primary election in 2020. Now, fortunately, the state Senate, the state legislature was in session and we were able to remedy that quickly. But I have concerns about the access discussion, because had we not been able to address that issue, had the legislature not been in session, we would have had no way at all to verify absentee ballots in the state of Oklahoma. I want to address Ms. Sewell's comment about government issue ID. I think we both are on the side of wanting that in Oklahoma. You have to show an ID when you show up at the polls. Even as a member of Congress that's been going to the same polling location for 16 years, and the poll workers know who I am and get excited to see me when I actually get to go vote in person, they still say, Congresswoman Bice, would you please show us your ID? That being said, I want to make a distinction. A student ID is different from a hunting license in that it is not government issued. A student ID is not government issued. And so there is that distinction there, which I think is why there are certain laws protecting those IDs. Not suggesting a student ID isn't valid. I'm saying the laws, especially in Oklahoma, it has to be a government-issued ID. It can be a tribal, it can be federal, it can be state. And there is that distinction. You also, Ms. Sewell also addressed issues with addresses on tribal lands, and I fully appreciate that issue, which is why I'm actually excited that the ACE Act tries to remedy that by requiring the states, the tribes, and the Postal Service to come together to be able to fix what seemingly is a challenge with physical addresses, especially as she mentioned in the state of North Dakota. My question is a couple. First of all, Mr. Warner, when you sign your name on a document, do you sign your name the same every single time?
No, I don't.
Mr. Cuccinelli? No. Mr. von Spakovsky? My apologies for butchering that, sir.
Well, I try to, but signatures all vary.
Mr. Palmer?
I try to, but again, no.
Mr. Gloria?
Yes, I do make an attempt to try to keep it consistent.
The question is important because, Mr. Gloria, in the state of Nevada, the only way that you have to verify a ballot is through signature verification. Is that correct?
That is the first level of verification, is to check that the signature matches. That's correct.
How can you have any sort of sense of accuracy or confidence in the ability to accept a ballot when almost everyone on this panel today, and I would add myself into this mix, would tell you that their signatures vary, sometimes widely, when they sign a document, especially as we age. My voter registration when I was 18 years old is probably pretty different than the signature I now have at almost 50. How can we have any certainty that these ballots are valid?
Well, I would say first off, Congresswoman, and thank you for the question. We have a database of signatures, so any document that comes from the voter, whether they're signing in to vote, whether it's an absentee ballot, or mail ballot, I should say, or an update of information.
Can you clarify updated information for
We
me?
store that signature in our database, and
Can
so
you-
we have a bank of them.
Can you clarify updated information for me?
Updated information related to their address, that would be one example.
So it's solely related to voter, you're not collecting signatures from other either entities or private business, is that correct?
Not private business, no, Congresswoman, but we do collect them from the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Okay. Thank you, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We do have votes at 4 o'clock, so I'm going to try to keep everybody at 5. Mr. Sarbanes is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the opportunity to wave one to the committee. I want to thank the panelists for being here today. As you know, we had a piece of legislation in the last Congress called the For the People Act, which was H.R. 1. The goal was not to federalize elections across the country. The goal was to set some uniform standards that then states and local jurisdictions could seek to meet in a variety of ways. But the idea was to try to make it easier for people to access the ballot box, eliminate what has been in many places sort of running an obstacle course in order to have their voice heard. That was among a variety of reforms that were contained in the bill. We continue to view strengthening our democracy as an absolute priority. We recently relaunched the Task Force on Strengthening Democracy, which brings together members of our caucus who view this as a priority, and that could be pretty much everybody in our caucus, but we have leadership that's on the front lines in many places across the country, seeing the opportunity for people to cast their vote, have their voice heard, diminished, it seems, increasingly with each passing day. I also want to note that if you're looking for examples of where the elections were fraudulent, where there was evidence of fraud, the 2020 presidential election is not the place to look. Experts agree, impartial, objective experts agree, that that election was one of the most free of fraud, an election with absolute integrity in many respects that we've seen. And that was corroborated and validated, by the way, through a whole series of court decisions, which batted away the notion that fraud had occurred in that election. The evidence is that the incidence of fraud is extremely small when you look at American elections. The bigger problem, if you're looking for integrity, is how to protect the integrity of the voices of the voters and the American people. And the way you do that is you make it so that when somebody gets up in the morning on the day they've decided to cast their vote, whether that be by mail, whether it be at an early voting center, whether it's on election day, that they have confidence that they can complete that transaction without it being an ordeal. That's all we're trying to aspire towards here in setting those uniform standards. So I'd like actually Mr. Gloria to ask you, based on your experience, among the reforms that we wanted to see, these uniform standards established at the federal level to apply to elections, by the way, involving United States citizens across the country, were universal no-excuse mail-in voting, early voting, automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, online voter registration, access to ballot drop boxes, and so forth. Based on your experience, some 30 years experience administering elections, can you tell us more about how some of these policies in Nevada have been implemented? And can you tell us about the safeguards in place to ensure that both the process was secure and that a voter was given a real chance to ensure that their ballot was counted if there was any kind of an error?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. That is a broad area to cover in 40 seconds. So I will start with the automatic voter registration. It was a collaborative effort with the Secretary of State after the law was passed. We worked for a year to develop the program to ensure that we would receive secure data from the DMV, updated information related to voter registration, so that we could use that trusted transaction with a government entity to get them registered to vote. So our voter rolls did increase as a result of that activity, and it was very successful in the state of Nevada. With the mail ballot process, as a result of trying to react to the COVID pandemic, which was very tough to deal with, the mail process that we had many processes already in place that were, where our processes were statutorily mandated. And so what they added was a cure process. They added some additional time to receive that ballot as long as it was postmarked. Those efforts were very successful in the state of Nevada.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. Mr. De-Esposito is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions. I'll start with, I guess, locally first. And I guess you could go down the row and anyone or everyone can answer. Here in the nation's capital, D.C. recently enacted non-citizen voting, which would allow staff from Chinese and Russian embassies to vote in D.C. elections. The first question is, which I think is fairly obvious, does anyone think this is a good idea? We'll start
at
No,
the end?
no, it's a terrible idea.
Absolutely not.
No.
I'd rather not express an opinion. We're not here to endorse anything with the election center, or, quite frankly, as an election official, we administered, we weren't involved with the policy.
Okay. All right, so I guess the next question would be, could allowing members of the CCP and Russian nationals to vote in our elections, and I'll speak not only here, but in our country's election, be viewed, you all have institutional knowledge, as foreign interference? And I guess that's a basic yes or no.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course it's foreign interference.
I think it would hurt voter confidence.
I appreciate it. And that's really why the questions are being asked, because the whole point today is to talk about the American confidence in voting. And when you have the nation's capital, which is supposed to be what everyone looks at as the, the representation of this great country, and we're allowing Russian and Chinese staff from embassies to vote in our elections, that's really why the question was asked. So my next question is to Mr. von Spakovsky. I'm going to bring it back home to New York. So in 2022, a law was enacted in New York City that would have allowed non-citizen voting in local elections if it hadn't been struck down by a state Supreme Court justice that same year. However, other jurisdictions across the country, like Washington, D.C., do allow non-citizens to vote in their local elections. Non-citizens are prohibited by federal law from voting in federal elections. Obviously, back in New York, we're thankful that the state Supreme Court justice stepped in. It has become a city of no rules, as I'm sure many of you have seen on the news. So I'm going to ask you, what actions can election officials take to ensure that non-citizens who are permitted to vote in local elections are not voting in federal elections?
Well, in fact, that's the real problem. Election officials in every state maintain one list of registered voters that are qualified to vote in local elections, state elections, and federal elections. And the absolute only way I know of that you could prevent mistakes from occurring and prevent aliens from voting in those other elections that they're not supposed to be voting in is to have two entirely separate voter registration lists and two entirely separate ballots if you have local elections at the same time on the same day as state and federal elections, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of confusion that exists, for example, on Election Day, and you're going to have bleeding over from local elections into state and federal. I mean, I don't know of any other way to prevent that from happening.
And I agree with you. And Mr. Gloria, no disrespect, that's really why the question was asked, because our whole purpose today is to talk about the American people's confidence in elections. And I think when we're allowing issues like this to take place throughout the country, it is quite a slap in the face to anybody's confidence. Next, I'm Mr. Cuccinelli. I sit as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, and I know during your tenure as part of the Department of Homeland Security, you served as both Deputy Secretary and Principal Deputy and Senior Official performing the duties of the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Does DHS make its SAVE database available to states to verify a voter's citizenship status?
Technically, yes, but it's been made so thoroughly cumbersome and expensive that it has proven impractical for states to use it. It's only been used twice that I know of, and in those two instances, it was for small samplings of each of those two states.
Okay, so as far as you know, and obviously I'm not going back in all the time of history, but as far as you know, that database has only been used two instances and never during a general election.
Well, I wouldn't characterize it by where in the cycle, because they're continually doing cleaning efforts, or some of them are. Nonetheless, it's only been used twice, ever, and those states didn't come back to use it again. Cumbersome and expensive.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I know my time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Cuccinelli, I'd like to pick up on that last answer. So you mentioned the SAVE database is not in widespread use by election officials. It's cumbersome, it's expensive. Are there tools that Homeland Security has that could be useful and accessible to election officials in trying to identify citizenship status?
Well, the SAVE database could be used more simply if it were allowed to be and structured to be. I was at USCIS only 6 months before I moved on to be the acting deputy secretary, and spent some time paying attention to the subject and realized just what a cumbersome effort that it took. And they do everything they can to make it harder, honestly. It is bureaucratic in addition to the structure of the database being problematic. And it has its limitations. We don't keep lists in this country of citizens. What the SAVE database includes is people who we've had contact with who are not citizens. So obviously, if you think of the gotaways at the border, million plus gotaways at the border under the Biden administration, they're not in the SAVE database.
Thank you. To that point, Mr. Von Spakovsky, first of all, thank you for being here today. I commend your work as the manager of the Heritage's election law reform, and both the election fraud database and the scorecard have been valuable tools for us in our work to promote voter confidence. To bring this home for us, if you would please go back to the subject of what tools can the federal government be providing to help states have accurate voter registration lists, SAVE database, other tools. What can we be doing to help state election officials improve the accuracy of the lists?
Well, as Secretary Warner said, the Social Security's Master Death Index is a requirement. States ought to be able to use it easily, freely, and frequently without being charged by the federal government to do it. The DHS databases need to be, as Ken Cuccinelli says, restructured and made easy to use by election officials so that they can do that. Use that also to check on citizenship status. States need to be allowed to require proof of citizenship when people register to vote in exactly the same manner that all employers in the country have to fill out the federal I-9 form to show that a person they're hiring is, like I said, a U.S. citizen or is an alien who's here legally and has a work permit. I just don't understand why it's okay for the federal government to require that of employers and people like me when I get hired, but supposedly the state should not be able to be allowed to do that. Any other federal databases that contain information on where people reside and live should also be open to the states to use to check their voter registration list. The whole point of this, like I said, is to get clean rolls. Now, if I can make one more point, I'm constantly hearing people saying, oh, well, if you do that, states are going to purge all these voters and people are not going to be able to vote. No state, when they do these database comparisons, automatically takes people off the rolls. They use the information they get, showing, for example, that someone is not a U.S. citizen, and then they engage in an individual investigation to make sure that information is accurate. And second, when states make a mistake, let's say they mistakenly believe that someone has moved to another state and they take them off the rolls, the idea that they're not going to be able to vote is wrong. Why? Because Congress, when it passed the Help America Vote Act in 2002, put in a requirement that every state allow provisional balloting. And that federal law, which all the states follow, says if you show up at a polling place and your name is not on the list, they've mistakenly removed you. If you tell the election official, I'm a registered voter and I'm eligible to vote, they have to give you a ballot. They give you a provisional ballot, you complete it, you fill out information basic information on when you registered. It's set aside and election officials have to investigate it. They have to decide whether your vote counts. When I was a county election official in Virginia for 3 years, we would get provisional ballots like that, and if we discovered that a mistake was made, the ballot got counted. So even in those, I think, rare circumstances where state officials make a mistake, folks are still going to be able to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Votes have been called. We're going to try to get through 2 more members' questions. Ms. Tenney is now recognized for five minutes.
Thank
or
you,
less.
Chairman Stile. Thank you, Congressman Morelli, who's kind of my neighbor. I surround him with my new district. And happy to say that I went from winning by 109 votes to nearly 90,000 after what happened in 2020. So a big difference in our awareness on getting up to speed. And because of that, I founded the Election Integrity Caucus in the House, along with Mike Garcia, who also had a very narrow win. I just want to name a couple things. Confidence in our elections is very low. In the weeks leading up to the 2020 midterm election, Pew Research polling found only 22% of voters believed the midterms would be administered very well, with only 11% of Republicans and 35% of Democrats. Only 26% of voters are very confident that their vote will be counted when voting with absentee ballots or early voting. This is not a good look. This is definitely not just a Republican or Democrat issue. If you go down to New York City, one of my New York City colleagues said, you've got to do something about election integrity in New York City because the Democratic primaries aren't fair. And I'll leave the name out of that person for now. But I wanted to first, I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to jump to Mr. von Spakovsky. You've done a lot of work with us. Thank you for all of you. I think almost all of you have appeared at our election integrity forums. And I just want to, you just mentioned something that's really important. Isn't it a lot easier to look at a ballot, to determine the validity of a provisional ballot than to try to take back a ballot that was improperly placed, especially if you put it into a voting machine?
Well, that's exactly right. If someone votes who, for example, it turns out later, doesn't actually live where they're registered to vote, they're from another state and they falsely registered, you can't take that ballot out of the ballot box. And for folks who think that doesn't happen, a judge overturned an election in Compton, California just last year based on the fact that half a dozen individuals falsely registered to vote in Compton, voted in that election, and they overturned a city council election. The election they falsely voted in was decided by 1 vote.
I agree. I mean, that was our experience. I mean, once you put that ballot in the machine, rightly or wrongly, there's no taking it back. And that's why the provisional ballot, I'd rather see us clean up and do list maintenance and clean up our ballot rolls. I mean, I continue to get an election notification request for my son who hasn't lived in my house for many years and is registered somewhere else and has been registered for 7 years. But I continue to get from New York State, which is one of the worst, I know, a ballot, a registration. No, you will be voting on this day in this location. And I know that there's a lot of controversy over, say, ERIC and some of these other types of systems, but isn't there something we can do maybe to improve ERIC or to come up with another system to make sure that we don't have duplication of voters when, voting in different states? And I would propose that to you, maybe Mr. von Spakovsky, maybe Mr. Cuccinelli.
One of the biggest problems states have, look, states can do a lot on their own. The one problem they have is finding individuals who are registered in other states. One of the things that states should start doing, which they haven't done before, Tennessee, I believe, is actually one of the first states to pass a law allowing this, is in addition to government databases, states should start accessing and using commercial databases like credit agencies. Why? Well, it probably doesn't surprise you that credit bureaus have a lot more up-to-date information than government databases because they're in business to make a profit and they try to keep their information accurate. And there's a lot of information.
Wouldn't you say, excuse, just to reclaim my time, wouldn't you say there's a liability issue there? Where they're going to be removed from being able to do that, or they're not going to get the bid on the job the next time? Well, I mean, at least there's some certification or some type of control in place. When it's government, it's never going to end. There's never going to be accountability, really.
No, that's right. So
and I don't mean to
like
blame.
They can do. Yeah,
I mean, the boards of elections are, in my case, we went almost 10 times the number of absentee ballots because of the pandemic, 100 rules changes by Governor Cuomo at the time, no new resources. It was a complete unfair situation for our boards of elections. Yes, they made mistakes, but they also didn't have the resources. I liken it to the southern border. We don't have enough people to deal with the crisis there, and we blame the border agents, but they're doing the best job they can. It's just like many of these people that serve in the boards of elections. They're trying to make this work. They can't even coordinate or couldn't coordinate under the HR 1 that Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats put through last cycle. They wouldn't even be able to coordinate with other states. So I think that you're right. I appreciate it. Sorry I didn't get to the rest of you, but I know time is late and votes have been called. But thank you so much for what you do for preserving and protecting election integrity, all of you on the panel. Thanks for being here.
The gentlewoman yields back. There's about 300 people that haven't voted. I think I'm the last one to do questions. We'll do that, and then we'll wrap it up. I now recognize myself for the purpose of asking questions. Mr. Gloria, if I can, you stated earlier that the primary form of identification used in Nevada is signature verification because you don't have voter ID. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And you have a voter signature matching machine that matches voter ID. Is not a completely human process. Is that correct?
It makes the first attempt. Yes.
Right. So there's a machine that's utilized in the first attempt, and you can dial the percentage match on this machine between 100% match, which we all know wouldn't work because signatures aren't 100% accurate if it's the same individual, anywhere from 0 to 100, and you chose 40% match. Is that accurate?
No, sir, that's completely incorrect. The setting is not a percentage. For whatever reason, the manufacturer decided to choose 0 to 100, and so a lot of people incorrectly assume that it's a percentage. There's an exercise that every jurisdiction must go through, depending on what system they're using to verify signatures. And so it depends on the quality of your signature database. It requires a 200 DPI signature in order to verify that signature. So you run tests, and you get to a point where you're comfortable that all of the signatures...
You're comfortable, meaning that in your unilateral decision that number, not a percentage, thanks for the correction, that number is the right number. Is that accurate?
Well, what I was going to say, Congressman, was that when we, and I shouldn't say, it was not I, it was a group of us who verified the information, felt that we had a level of integrity in that every single signature that the machine verified was in fact a match. And so
Understood, and the dial was set at 40, not a percentage, but a number 40, which ranged from 0 to 100, and that was a human decision. I'd offer that photo ID is a far better form of matching a ballot to the individual. Would you agree with that, Mr. Cuccinelli?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Warner?
Yes.
If I could just add one comment. Signature verification is the lowest form of voter identification. It is something, but it's barely above 0.
I would sure think so. It'd be pretty easy to match a signature of any member of Congress. It's all available on Wikipedia for almost every single member. Let me go back to you, Mr. Gloria. During the 2020 election cycle, did Clark County accept funding for election administration from non-government sources?
Yes, we did.
And do you know how much Clark County received from non-government sources,
I
roughly?
believe it was approximately $2.4 million.
And do you know who that was from?
That came from CTCL.
CTCL provided $2.39 million to Clark County. And I ask unanimous consent to enter Clark County CTCL grant agreement into the record. So ordered. Mr. Gloria, which organizations provided, let me shift. Did you solicit the grant from CTCL?
We did request it.
So in that process, was any of the grant funding used to send out mail ballots to all registered voters for the November 2020 election?
Some of the funding was used for that.
So some of the funding was used to send that out. The Public Interest Legal Foundation reported that Clark County sent out 1,325,000 ballots for the primary election, and more than 223,000 of those were mailed to the wrong or outdated addresses. In the general election, your office sent out 1.277 million ballots, and 92,000 of those were returned undeliverable or wrong I'm going to say that again because I think it's important to get in the record. In the general election, your office sent out 1,277,000 ballots, and 92,000 of those were returned undeliverable to wrong or outdated addresses. Did you perform list maintenance as required under the National Voter Registration Act between 2018 and 2020?
Yes, Congressman, we sure did.
You did. And do you have confidence that your elections process, when do you have confidence in elections process when voter rolls, do you have confidence in the voter rolls in Clark County?
Absolutely, Congressman, and I have to tell you that it's a bit of a unique county in that it's very transient. A lot of people come into Clark County, give it a
Understood.
shot, and they leave, so there's a challenge in dealing with that.
It is a challenge. It's one of the things that the ACE Act works to assist states in improving, cleaning their voter rolls, which I think is essential. I want to look ahead to the 2024 election with you. Have you received additional funding from CTCL for the 2024 election?
Congressman, I'm no longer the registrar of voters in Clark County, Nevada.
Okay, I will note that that Clark County has received another $3 million from CTCL, $1 million to Clark County recently, and a promise to give another $2 million in December of this year. So do you know what those funds will be used for?
I'm no longer the registrar of voters there, but I believe that my successor has quite a few areas where we still need to make improvements to our facility. We quickly moved
Understood.
to
While
another
you were in that role, was Clark County required to have any kind of membership agreement with the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence, a project of CTCL, to receive the grant funding?
Required to? No, I don't believe there was a requirement.
Did Clark County enter into an agreement with CTCL for that purpose?
We
Or the
actually
election-
applied to be a member of that group, and we were accepted out of several
And
hundred people that applied.
did Clark County share any of its election data as part of the membership agreement to receive the grant funds?
Election data? I'm sorry?
Yes, election data.
No, we did not.
Okay. And have you worked in your capacity with Arabella Advisors while working with Clark County or otherwise? And are you aware that one of the major donors is a foreign national to Arabella Advisors?
I was not.
If you knew that one of the major donors to Arabella Advisors was a foreign national, would that cause you concern?
If we had known at the time, it would have been something that I would have made our commission aware of.
Well, maybe that's something we should broadly look into. I appreciate everyone being here today, but I want to just wrap up because I want to follow up on this point, especially with CTCL, if I can, very briefly with you, Mr. Cuccinelli. In addition to Clark County, several other locations, including in my home state of Wisconsin, receive CTCL grants, often referred to as Zuckerbucks, colloquially. Does private funding of elections by groups like CTCL pose a threat to the integrity of our elections?
Both the integrity of and the confidence in our elections, absolutely.
And do you believe that the CTCL grants influence the 2020 election?
They flipped it.
Would anyone else like to comment on whether or not the CTCL grants influence the 2020 election?
I agree wholeheartedly.
You agree wholeheartedly what?
It was used to get out the vote as opposed to what they said they were going to do, and that was provide PPE for, due to COVID.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
I would strongly disagree.
May the record know you disagree. I'm going to close on this question, Mr. Cuccinelli, I'll come to you first. Should non-government entities that provided funding for elections be eligible for tax deductions?
The answer to that, using the Zuckerbucks example, is absolutely not. This was partisan activity in outcome.
I'm really tight on time. Does anybody else want to comment on that? No. I get very concerned that they're utilizing a tax deduction service to engage what I believe is partisan politics. I'm going to wrap it up there. I yield back to myself. I now would like to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. It has been very helpful. Members of this committee may have additional questions for you, and we ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member shall have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. I'll be jogging down to the floor to make it in the vote, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. I'm racing octogenarians, I got this.